Welcome back everyone, this is CodePulse here with another video, this time on my second channel. So the videos on this channel probably won't be as high quality and I won't be doing that much editing or anything, but I should be able to get the videos out much quicker. So in this video we are going to be discussing global variables and context in relation to programming languages. So there are quite a few problems with global variables. The first problem is the pollution of the global namespace. And this is especially noticeable in languages such as C and C++, where once you include a header file, then the global namespace gets permanently polluted across the entire application. So a solution to this problem is to have your code in separate modules or namespaces, and you can then import those modules in your other modules, and each module has its own unique global namespace. When we have global mutable runtime variables, then we can have variable modification conflicts. So when two pieces of code modify a variable at the same time, then the value of the variable will probably not be what you expected. This only occurs in multi-threaded environments, and the solution to solve this problem is with thread locks. Also, the Rust language does a great job of this with the concept of ownership. There are three more problems that I will be focusing on in this video. So of course it is very difficult to test your code when you have global variables, because those variables could be defined in other modules or other sections of your code, and then when you test a particular section you won't actually have access to that global variable. Another problem with global variables is that your code is not pure. And what I mean by this is it's not consistent. If you put in the same input, you are not guaranteed to get the same output. So what this basically means is that the code has side effects, and it can become very difficult to reproduce a problem. There's also plenty of optimizations that programming languages can make when your code is pure. So then the final thing is what I call data leaks. So this is when you are modifying a global variable and you only expect this data to be available in a certain scope of your application. So the best way to explain this is probably with an example. So if you've heard of the idea of server-side rendering when you have a website, so the idea is that there is JavaScript that is shared between the client and the server. The server runs that JavaScript to perform an initial render. So then the client has a copy of that code and continues to run that code in order to hydrate the website without having to communicate back to the server. So the problem with this is that a lot of your client code may be accessing global variables. And now if that code runs on a server, you might be leaking private personal data into a global variable that other users that are requesting data from that website will then see. So I forgot to mention that these bottom four here mainly refer to mutable runtime variables. So now we are going to look at context and how it solves some of those problems, specifically the ones that I highlighted in yellow. So the idea of context is rather than accessing a global variable, you're instead passing a context object into all the functions in your program. Each context object has multiple fields and values associated with each field. So when we use context, the fields and the values of the context are now part of the API of your program. So any function in your program that needs to access a certain field and value will have to take in that context variable. And this means you cannot accidentally not have a global variable defined. You will always have to pass the context into your function, and assuming the field isn't optional, then it will always be available. This definitely improves the ability to test your code. This also makes your functions pure, because if you pass in the same context into a function twice, then you will receive the same result. You could still say that the functions have side effects because they could be modifying variables in the context, but that only applies if you are passing in the same context twice, which you probably will be, but at least it gives the option of being pure if you just pass in a unique context every time. And again, this will make it easier to test your code, because then you can just pass in whatever context object you want. So by using context, this doesn't immediately prevent data leaks. You still have to go through the effort of creating a new context object whenever you have to create a new layer or scope or whatever you want to call it. Hello, it's me from the future, and I forgot to say that by using global variables instead of a context variable, it can be that slight bit faster for lower level languages. So now I'd like to discuss my idea on how languages can connect global variables and context together. So it would be a solution that solves the problems I mentioned earlier on, but doesn't require the hassle of adding support for context in your program. So the idea is that we can still use global variables, but there are a couple of language features that would be necessary. So let's say we have some function that needs access to this global variable. When using context, we would take in a context parameter, and then whatever variables we are accessing would then be part of the API of that function. So what I propose is that if a function is accessing a global variable, then somehow in the function signature it would specify that it is accessing that variable. So you can kind of see this in action in Python when you use the global keyword inside a function, and this makes it clear that you are modifying a global variable. The other idea then is to have a statement which I call the with statement, and don't get this confused with the with statement that already exists in other languages. This keyword was just the first idea that came to my head. So what the with statement does is it changes a global variable only for the current scope. So let's say you need to run some code, so I have this run some code function. If you need this run some code function to have a new context, so you want to create a new layer or scope, or again whatever you want to call that, then you can use the with statement to change these global variables only for this scope. So what we do is we reassign some variable to some new value, and at the end of the current scope it will automatically reassign some variable back to what the variable was before we assigned it here. So this would be equivalent to the following Go code, where we create a copy of some variable into the old value variable. We then assign some variable to our new value for the current scope. So in order to get the old value back at the end of the scope, we would reassign some variable to old value, but we'd use the defer keyword, which basically says run this code at the end of the function. So this is not the worst way of doing it, but the with statement would greatly simplify it for programmers. And the other thing is that the with statement would do the defer automatically, and this means you won't forget to put that in, and if you do forget to put that in, then once your function returns, all the other code in your application would suddenly stop working. Or your code might continue to run, but then you've suddenly got a really bad data leak. So I do want to say that the global variable should probably be in some other module or namespace, and I do want to do another video discussing modules and dependency management in another video. So that is going to be the end of this video. If you've enjoyed, don't forget to leave a like and share this video, and please leave a comment below on what you think about what I've said in this video, and I will see you all next time.